And if you ask me one thing, I tell everybody, I spent a lot of time with Dad. If there's ever one thing you can do, it's spend time with loved ones. If there's one thing, lottery ticket, lottery winning numbers tonight, I'd ask for one thing. Another minute with my daddy. Thank you all very much.
Well, I'm Timothy Hobart, named after my dad's father. I'm the baby. Please note that I know this is my father's life celebration, but I wasn't his baby. I am my mama's baby. If you ever wanted to hear my dad cuss, you just needed me to get around him. I could make Dad mad. I could upset him like no other. But my father loved me unconditionally, just the same. When I was little and lived in Michigan, my father worked. When we moved to Kentucky, my father worked. I have childhood memories with my father, but my memory of my father is that he always worked. When I became intelligent and educated, I was midway through college and I wanted to have a conversation with my dad. Again, I've become educated. I'd learned some things in college that were really important. I learned in college all the things my dad had done that he'd failed at. I took my high educated learning and I came home to have a conversation with my dad because I wanted to discuss the things that were most important. So I shared with my dad the two biggest things that were on my list that he didn't do but should have done. Again, my brother says we had a unique relationship with our father, and we did. I could make him cuss, but he loved me and he'd do anything to help me. And us having the ability to have a real conversation with our father was extremely real. I didn't have to worry. You didn't have to mince words. You could say what you wanted to say. And so I told my dad I learned these things and I wanted to discuss the two main things that he'd never done with me. Here's what I said. Number one, my dad never took me fishing. And number two, my dad had never taken me hunting. Doesn't sound like much, but I hear stories about all these other people. And my dad took me here and we did this. And so I shared those two thoughts with my dad. My dad heard my list. And he admitted it was true. He had never, ever taken me hunting. He'd never, ever taken me fishing. Matter of fact, he apologized for it. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't do that." He said, "If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you two questions." Sure. He said, "Who bought you a boat?" And then he said, "If you don't mind, tell me, who bought you your first gun?" I remember a conversation my father was having with his mother. We were over in Stinking Creek. And remember, my father was a hard worker. And when I say hard, I mean a laborer. In Detroit, my dad worked two jobs. He worked for General Motors and he worked for Vince Anamati, and they poured concrete. He poured the Detroit Bridge. He poured swimming pools. He worked. And so when he came back to Kentucky, my grandmother and he were having this conversation because she thought Dad should slow down some. And Dad could wear a suit and tie, and he loved to wear a suit and tie. But he could get down and dirty. He did not mind to do that. And a matter of fact, a part of his ethics was that he would never ask you to do what he had not already done or would not be willing to do again. And so here we are having this, I'm listening to this conversation. And when we'd moved back to Kentucky in 1971, the store burned to the ground. My parents lost literally everything they had. I grew up as a child having people say, everything's been given to you. You don't do nothing. I heard all those statements, little rich boy. My parents lost everything they had in a single night. They left Michigan, came to Kentucky. It was devastating to our family. My brother was working there. My sister was helping. They lost everything, but my father was a worker and a provider, and he said, we will rebuild. The conversation that he was having with his mother kind of went like this. She said, James Ernest, you're killing yourself. You can't work like you're working. And my grandmother said, those kids don't deserve that stuff. You give them too much. I remember my grandfather, I remember moving back from Warren. When my grandfather loaded up the U-Haul, he said, whose toys are these? He couldn't believe that kids would have that much toys. But when my grandmother said the kids don't need that much stuff, this is what my dad said. He said, I want them to have a different life than I had. My father gave us toys because he never had toys. He made that happen. A part of my conversation with my father when I was educated and intelligent also included this. Dad said, you're right. I didn't take you hunting. I didn't take you fishing. But he expounded. And he said, let me ask you this question too. Who paid for your piano lessons? Who paid for your guitar lessons? Who paid for your singing lessons? When you wanted to be a part of 4-H, who paid for that? Who drove you to Lexington? Who was it took you to camp? When you wanted to go on a trip and you wanted to follow your dreams and your passions, and I was 21 at this stage, he said, I just want to know who provided for that. My dad made it happen. Another conversation I had with my father happened on the hearth in our family living room. It was me and him and Mom. God was working in my life. It was 1981, 1982, 1983, and I'd come to this spot in my life where I really felt like God could use me. He kept telling me he could use me. He wanted to use me, and I was so struggling with, what do you do in ministry? How is this going to work? I wanted to serve. Might be a preacher, might be an evangelist, might do chaplaincy, singing, writing, I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I knew that God said, just give it to me and I'll take care of it. Well, when we sat down at that hearth, my conversation with my dad was, Dad, I need advice. I really don't know what to do. My dad told me, he said, this is not going to be easy. He said, I provided for you, but ministry is going to be tough. People are not always going to appreciate you, and they're not always going to like you. And sometimes they won't even care. He painted a very realistic picture. But he said, me and your mother will support you 100%, all that we can. He was correct. It hadn't been easy. I'm looking at a big crowd, and I'm certain you could say, boy, I had a preacher who's hurt me. It's pretty normal. But preachers are humans too. Boy, sometimes we've been hurt by churches in ways that you can never, ever really explain. I apologize if you've ever been hurt by a preacher. I apologize if I've ever hurt you. But my dad was correct for me as a minister. It hadn't been easy. This conversation that I had led me into a conversation that spanned several years. My father wanted me to do what I wanted to do. He never once said, I want you to work in the furniture store. He said, do what you want to do. And I did do what I wanted to do. But here's some things that I learned from a growing conversation. I learned that when my dad was 14 years of age, he prayed at the Salem Baptist Church in Mills, Kentucky, and asked Jesus to come into his heart and to forgive him. My dad's sister, Alice Marie, was in that church service. I later asked Alice Marie about this, and she said watching her brother walk the aisle, she knew and felt God burning inside of her. But she said, but I didn't go. She said, I let James Ernest go, but I wanted to follow. And Alice would later tell me as well that when Dad was baptized, which my father was baptized in front of his grandfather's house and store, Nasby Mills, in the creek. And Aunt Alice said that when Dad was baptized, she had this burning fire inside of her saying, boy, I need to do that. And Aunt Alice told me later in her life, in her 60s, the worst decision she ever did was not do what she felt God called her to do. And she said, I should have went when James Ernest went. My Aunt Alice was not saved until later years in her life. And she said, I never, ever should have waited. She said, I should have followed James Ernest. My father told me about going to the love tunnel. You'd have to understand it. If you've ever been in Acorn Fork, you know all about it. 2 rocks cross, and that's where you go to smooch your sweetheart. But my dad would go in also and sit up on top of those rocks, and he said, I would dream. I said, what did you dream, Dad, as a 14-year-old? He said, what life was like out of here. It's hard to imagine for me, because I've gone anywhere and everywhere. It's hard to imagine what it is to be a child and say, I'm going to sit up on the rock. I wonder what life is like somewhere else. I'm looking at his pallbearers and his honorary pallbearers, and I know, Goebel, you know exactly what that is. Kurt, you know what that is. You older ones know what that's like. That was my dad. My dad was saved at young age. Saved at 14. 3 years later, my dad's gone. He's in Detroit. He's gone and gotten his grandfather's notary stamp, changed his birth certificate so he could get a job in Detroit and start to make his own way. I've been counseled, mentored, developed, loved on. My dad didn't get that. He had a different relationship. But he knew he needed Jesus. He got Jesus. He just didn't have anyone to come alongside and help him. There are 2 big spiritual influences, though, in my father's life. One was his grandfather's passing. When great-grandpa MB died, it was huge in my dad's life. Because my great-grandfather was a Christian. He'd gotten saved sitting on a wagon in the barn outside the house. And when I asked Big Nabe, as he's called, I said, Grandpa, why'd you get saved? He said, Mama was always praying for me, and said, I would just sit down on the wagon after milking, and I thought, And I heard the Lord say, you go and leave this barn. You won't make it to the porch. And he said, I prayed. Best decision he ever made in his life. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was a great spiritual influence. See, my grandfather knelt on my dad's driveway at his home in RJ, and I prayed with my grandfather when he prayed to ask Christ to come into his life. One of my favorite stories about my grandpa is that when Grandpa, and he was a changed man once he became a Christian. And he was in the hospital here at Pineville, and he called me. He would call me in, and I'd go talk to him. Jim would take him milkshakes, but I'd go and talk. And Grandpa would whisper in my ear. And I'd often leave the room and come back. My dad got tired of this. And he said, I want to know what you're doing. What are you and your grandfather? What's going on? I said, well, Dad,